Hello and welcome to the Japan Zoominar at UC San Diego. I'm Ulrike Schede. I'm the director of JFIT, the Japan Forum for Innovation and Technology. JFIT is at GPS at UC San Diego. GPS stands for the School of Global Policy and Strategy. We are an international relations and public policy school. And if you don't know this, note that we have a Master's of International Affairs with a Japan specialization. If you're interested in studying Japan, check us out at gps.ucsd.edu. JFIT is a Japan center at UC San Diego, and if you'd like to know more about JFIT, please go to jfit.ucsd.edu. I also have my own website, thejapanologist.com, with a blog that strives to update us on Japanese business, society, and political economy. Our Zoominar is a weekly event. It is every Tuesday at 4:30 p.m. California time. And we have coming up a few other great things, events other than today's. Next week, we'll do Shinzo Abe, the iconoclast, with biographer Tobias Harris. We'll take a break for the election and then have a roundtable with my UCSD colleagues Megumi Naoi, Alice Krauss, and retired Admiral Robert Thomas on what the outcome of the election means for US-Japan relations. For further info on that, of course, you can yet again go to our website at jfit.ucsd.edu/Zoominar. While I have your attention, allow me to ask for your support. If this Zoominar is valuable to you, I would greatly appreciate if you'd consider making a small donation to our effort. Any amount will help. Your money will go to hiring a student, a research assistant who can help me with arranging the Zoominar. You can do this at jfit.ucsd.edu/support and click any of these buttons, and I'll take you straight to a place where you can put your credit card to work. If you're interested in getting involved in more activities here at JFIT, please send me an email at the below email address. Alrighty, and with that, we are here. Let me stop my share and let's turn to the important issue of women. Before I introduce my panelists, let me just briefly position what we're doing here today. When I started the Zoominar series 22 weeks ago or so, I clearly had women on my agenda. I wanted to do a thing on women, but I couldn't get my head around how to exactly do this. There are lots of talks on women in Japanese society. And of course, my good friend and colleague, Kathy Matsui, has driven this with her Womenomics. And it's all about numbers and how many women are on boards and how many women in managerial positions. And she's an economist, and that's a great first way to get a cut at this. But in my view, that's a necessary condition. That's not sufficient. Because if we only go by the numbers, then we'll have a lot of unhappy women in unhappy situations. So how to think about the qualitative change that has to happen to really bring women into the Japanese workforce and maybe go at this tight culture, society with its unconscious biases and expectations of what women are supposed to do and so forth. So once I had my head wrapped around that, that's what I wanted to, that's the question I wanted to ask, what Japanese women can do and what Japan society can do to make this change. It was clear who I would invite. I would invite my good friends and colleagues, Professor Karen Shire and Saki Tomita. So with that, let me introduce the two speakers of today. Professor Karen Shire is a native of Boston. She has a PhD in sociology from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She is the chair of comparative sociology and Japanese society at UDE, the University of Duisburg-Essen in Germany, which also happens to be my hometown university. And UDE, if I may say so myself, is one of Germany's best places to study contemporary Japan. So at UDE, there's an Institute of East Asian Studies where she is very active. She's also the director of the College for Gender Research. She spent a lot of time in Japan. She was an assistant professor for many years at ICU, the International Christian University. She was there in the 1990s. She was also at the University of Tokyo and more recently the Ochanomizu Women's University in Tokyo. She's also been a visiting professor in Australia, the Max Planck Institute in Cologne, Sheffield in the UK. And I'm saying all of this, Karen, just to point out that you have been a working woman in a large number of different countries. So thank you for joining me today. It is 1:30 a.m. in Germany where you are, so you're burning the midnight oil. It's great to have you. Thank you for joining us. And obviously you work on work and employment and all of these other things, which is why you're here. So thank you, Karen. Then I have Saki. Saki Tomita has a Bachelor of Engineering and is a civil engineer trained at the University of Tokyo. That alone puts you in an experience of a very male environment. She also holds an MBA from Stanford's Graduate School of Business, and she is the first student that went through our JUMP program, the Jose for Upper Management program at UC San Diego here at JFIT. So thank you, Saki, for doing that. You've spent 8 years at TEPCO, and you've built piers in Tohoku, and you've built infrastructure to Tohoku. You were involved in the Fukushima cleanup. And now you're a manager at TEPCO Ventures, which is TEPCO's open innovation arm that is investing in new technologies and new businesses. So you have lots of experience. You've also been an intern at the Asia Development Bank and at AutoGrid. So you've been in a lot of settings that were also very male. So thank you for joining us, Saki. We want to hear from you how you see the comparison between the US and Japan and the experience of women and the agency that women have to make these changes, right? So with that long introduction, sorry everybody, let me give the microphone to Karen. And Karen, tee us off with some thoughts on, that come out of your research on how we want to look at these questions.
Yep. Thank you very much for that introduction. I'm really, really happy to be here. And the nice thing about being invited to a talk that's 1:30 in the morning is that I have no schedule conflicts. Nobody will ring my phone. Nobody will walk in the door. I'm completely devoted to this talk. I'm really delighted to be paired with Saki this afternoon, this evening too, or morning for you, afternoon, evening, because it allows me to kind of link my more macro historical and societal perspective with the actual experiences of professional women in Japanese and international business. And I think you confronting things every day, that's going to be a really fun connection between us. Now, I'm going to focus on 3 things, and I'm going to do all of it in comparison to Germany, because one of my aims is to kind of break down this idea that Japan is somehow an outlier, a terrible place for women, a place that's completely conservative and traditional. And I think making some European comparisons will make that myth less believable. Also, I've worked in Germany for 21 years, so it's the country that I know most about. But there's some very good reasons to do a comparison with Germany. And for that reason, I'm going to start with some historical points. And then secondly, I'm going to talk about what has improved, especially in the societal context for working women in Japan. And also put that in comparison with Germany, because I think some things have improved more in Japan than they have in Germany. And of course, some things are better in Germany too. It's a balance. And finally, I want to focus in on a few challenges, especially in work situations for educated women who have the chance to enter leadership, and in that way, hopefully make a bridge to what Saki will talk about. Now, starting historically, the modernization of Germany and Japan from the late 19th century through to the end of the Second World War established a kind of gender system based on an extremely strong division of labor between women in the domestic sphere and men in the public sphere. And this was not just rooted in norms, it was rooted in law, in civil law, which very systematically subordinated women to their husbands or to the family heads in the family. And even though there were periods of democratization after World War I in both countries, this civil law did not change. It did not change until after World War II. Now, when it did change, of course, those changes were important, but they happened actually under foreign occupations, which had gender models that weren't necessarily modern either. They also situated women in the family, but of course on a more individual basis and less rooted in civil law. But some of those civil laws continue to exist, and I'll come back to that systematically subordinated women to the role of domestic wife and mother. But what did happen after 1945 was a number of changes in fiscal and social policies that in both countries functioned very strongly to take women out of employment and keep them in the family. And of course, women were in employment in the period of early industrialization, in the war period when their labor was needed. I'm talking about things like spousal deductions, extending social insurance coverage, tax-free earnings up to a certain amount, pension systems that give you Social Security, whether you work or not as a dependent spouse. In all of this, I would argue in both countries, and not only there, also in many Southern European and other Western European countries, function to make women available for domestic and reproductive labor. And they also meant that governments didn't invest in organizing it otherwise, whether in markets or in social welfare. Now, in some cases, there were also direct restrictions on women's participation in economy and politics. And I would say in Germany, they were even worse than in Japan. In Germany, we had women had to get the permission of their husbands to work until 1977. That's a pretty long time. In Switzerland, famously, women could not vote until 1971. All those things were changed and reformed much earlier in Japan. Now, the second point, of course, is what changes happened to break down this kind of welfare and fiscal policy and family system that makes women more available for family things than it makes them available for work. And I think the first important part of this is women themselves, and especially their participation in higher education, the agency of women to improve their education, to improve their capacities to engage in public life, in the economy, and in politics. And of course, this began to expand in the 1970s. Around the same time as the student movement, which also had a big impact on forming a second wave of the women's movement, which challenged these domestic roles. Now, there are some differences to note. In Japan, improving policies and legal frameworks depended a lot more on changes in international norms, while the different electoral system in Germany meant that women could mobilize much better within the political system for change, something that's still very difficult in Japan. Now, there were all kinds of changes in this period, and I'm already noticing that I'm running a little bit out of time, so I'll skip over them. The very important points in Japan were the equal employment opportunity law. And I know a lot of people like to talk about how bad that law is. I mean, it's been reformed about 4 or 5 times since it was passed in the late 1980s. And I think if we look at it carefully, we realize that it's getting better and better. And also, you know, Japan is not like the US. You don't take people to court. What you do is you shame them. And in that way, I think we have to look at some of the mechanisms differently than we do in other international contexts. In Germany, because the electoral system is so different, changes in party politics, especially the rise of the Green Party, were very important. And of course, in Germany, we also had the huge shock of the unification, which basically joined a very different gender system to the conservative German one. Now, at the risk of minimizing differences in political systems and opportunities, I want to emphasize some similarities in what has changed. Though Japan continues to have one of the lowest rates of mothers' employment when they are mothers of young children, there have been really big improvements in paid leaves, in pressures on corporations, in the expansion of infant care facilities. And this has increased the number of new mothers remaining employed. It's nearly doubled in the last 10 years to almost 40%. And I think that is a very important change. Of course, if you look at mothers overall, it's less. But those new mothers are the ones that we really need to target, because if they stay in the employment system at that point, then they have the chance to rise up within it. At the same time, governments in Germany were improving equality provisions for working women. Provisions were passed in Japan already in 2003, requiring firms and public administrations to draw up plans for supporting working parents. In 2009, short work options were advised for workers with infant children. There were 2 angel plans that improved infant coverage. Leaves for fathers were expanded. Under the short DPG rule, one of the very important things was the Labor Ministry of Komiyama Yoko, who integrated daycare facilities, who started positive action, which Abe eventually legislated, who reformed conditions for part-time workers. All of these were very, very significant changes. So what's, and I think maybe it's a debate with Abe. I mean, a lot of these changes start to really crystallize between 2013 and 2015. I think he was in the right place at the time when very long-term changes began to take hold. I wouldn't give him too much credit. He didn't initiate most of these changes, but he did continue them. Maybe that's to his credit. But as you know, 2020-30 didn't materialize. We now have 20-30-30. Women in leadership is still on average somewhere around 15% and not 30%. And that's my last point. That I think is the big challenge, the very slow progress in improving the presence of women in economic and also, of course, in political. Whoops, sorry about that. That's so that I don't go over time. Okay, it's not going to go off. Okay. The most attractive economic opportunities in terms of income and prestige are in very masculinized work cultures in sectors like automotives, electronics, finance, high tech. When women do enter these professions, they tend to be tracked, whether mothers or not, into domains with less visibility and where performance is harder to assess or where stakes are lower, going into personnel administration rather than operations. Going into retail rather than investment banking. And even in boards of directors, women are more likely to make it in as external directors in Japan or as labor representatives in Germany. The sector factor is closely related, I think, also to the choice of subjects in higher education. And I think Ulrike and I are also educators, so this is a big topic for us too. Still, in both countries, women are greatly underrepresented in STEM fields and more likely to study more general than technical subjects. Yet management in the STEM-based industries is still largely recruited from the engineering specializations. So on this note, I'm very eager now to hear from a Japanese engineer who's in one of these industries, and I turn the microphone virtually over to Saki.
Well, thank you, Karen. That's great. So, Saki, we'll let you unmute yourself so that we can hear you. Yes. So in many ways, you're one of these women who are supposed not to exist, but here you are. So share with us some of the, you've been in the United States, you've traveled a lot, you've been to Europe. Share with us what you think the big challenges are for working women in Japan in terms of qualitative changes at the workplace. Not so much your own challenges, but in general, right? You have a lot of friends, you have a lot of classmates and so forth. So you know how it is in the United States. So how does Japan compare?
Thank you for the question. One thing I was happily surprised at when I was living in the US was that there was so much conversation about this issue, about diversity, gender issues, working women. And compared to that, there's just not much conversation. about these issues in Japan. And I think that's a huge difference. People in the US are much more exposed to the issue. But in Japan, I won't say it's a taboo talking about this issue, not at all. But there needs to be much more energy to talk about this topic. It might be like once per year, twice per year, where there's a special program or there's a special occasion to talk about this. Whereas in the US, we have conversations about this with a group of friends or in the classroom. As you mentioned, I studied civil engineering in Japan. Very few women in this department. And I don't remember a single occasion where we talked about like diversity or gender in the classroom. And the difference in the MBA program was just like it was very different. So I think that leads to differences, especially in how people support each other, how we talk about allyship. It's not just about women, but how other people can support each other. Yeah, I think that's a huge area of challenge, having conversations about it, and natural conversations, daily conversations about it.
So, do you have any other reactions to Karen's observations? Is there anything that stood out for you that you would like to address?
I'm also a huge fan of numbers. You said that numbers are not enough, but I am a huge fan of numbers. I love the 20-30-30. And I think Japan, a like top-down approach, top-down movement fits well in this culture, in this society. And I think numbers do matter, and change is happening, but it's just too slow. We need to accelerate the change. So I think numbers really factor in, like accelerating the movement. I frequently hear people say, "Oh, I want to promote women, but I just can't find the talent," and that just sounds like a convenient excuse. It's so easy to like line up reasons for not doing something, but if you try, I think it could work. People can adjust. And coming from environments where I'm usually the only female employee at a certain division, a certain meeting, I think numbers matter. You need to see, like actually see the change to make a qualitative, quality does matter, but I think quantity leads to quality as well. So yes, that's something I think about.
So all of this doesn't happen just in a vacuum, right? The society is a backdrop setting, and society is most likely changing much more slowly than any particular company's culture can be changed, right? And so there's two levels here where we have this problem, and we actually already have a question in from Nancy who wants to know whether cultures might change. So maybe there's a Japanese company that's very forward looking, and they have a mentor system and they do all the right things, but still, Karen, you mentioned working mothers, but working mothers are not. The society has these sanctions, right? What is the right role of women? Women are supposed to be the primary caregivers. Women that are mothers and they don't make their bento real cute and kawaii get scolded by their mothers-in-law that the carrot is not cut like a flower or something. And the working women are often, subject to ijimeers and bullying by the PTA, that they're not good mothers and so on. So there's a societal setting within all of this is happening, right? So can companies be the actor here? Who has agency? I mean, the CEOs have agency, right? They can change their own company. Women have agency. They can change their own possibly self-handicapping behavior. Is Womenomics actually changing society? Is there enough nudging and shaming going on, or how could we structure this? Karen, you mentioned the Green Party in Germany being a big push for all of this, right? So what would be the Japanese equivalent to such a sort of a mechanism? How do we change? Or do we have to change within it, and we can't hope for society to change? Karen, you're a sociologist, so let me put that on your plate, because that's almost like an academic question, right? What do we know about this?
Yeah, well, I think institutions do matter. So the kind of litany of institutions that I was lining up there are opportunities for women who want to take the agency to try to make a career, to try to stay continually and gainfully employed, to try to strategize it. And I think, you know, we have to look at strategies for moving through the obstacles, because no obstacles are complete. But as you said, societal changes are slow, but if they're going to be meaningful, they need to be slow. So I don't think that the slowness is the problem. Maybe the second thing to mention is that part of those strategies involve alternatives. I mean, one of the things that has gone up in the numbers, if you look at the, you know, this yearly printout from the Gender Equality Bureau on the quotas, is the number of women entrepreneurs. And if you look at women's leadership across a broader set of sectors, you'll see that Japanese women are really leading the Japanese delegation in international organizations. And so, you know, maybe they can't get through here, but then they'll go through here. Ulrike, I know you wrote in your recent book also about the labor shortage being an opportunity for companies to finally get over this and hire more women. And we know that the only way to get over these kind of biases is to have more information. And you have more information through contact. Some very interesting German studies have looked at whether employees think that women are good managers or not over time. And at the time one, the manager was a man, and at the time two, the manager was a woman. And at time one, they say, no, women can't handle it. And at time two, after they've experienced women as a manager, they say, sure, they can do it too. And I think that's probably going to be the way that change happens. Now, what Saki said is very worrying to me, because if you're the only woman in a workplace, that's not a good setup for change. So numbers really do matter. But you know, numbers also don't change the institution. Numbers are the opportunity to change the institution. But until there's a critical mass of women in a meeting who can talk to each other and not just be talked at, then very little will change in the culture of the company. But maybe, Ulrike, as you've written, the labor shortage will finally be the jump start.
Well, although, you know, the whole Womenomics, so let me first say, I didn't mean to say that numbers don't matter. They obviously, they're the necessary condition, right? I mean, without women, we can stop the conversation and, you know, go back to cooking or something. But numbers alone are not enough, right? There has to also be a qualitative change. And with that, what I was referring to is a little bit this, you know, the pawahara, sekuhara, the harassments and the vertical hierarchies, and actually the question that I before we go back to this labor shortage thing and sort of market forces playing a trick here, I was also worried about what Saki was saying, that there's no energy around the topic. And I wonder whether there is also an element of self-handicapping that plays into this as well. I mean, the German movement did come out of women opening their mouths and saying, hey, we want this to change, right? And that goes a little bit to how do you actually bring about change in the Japanese tight culture setting, where there are certain ways, you know, you have to be appropriate and polite, and you can't rock the boat, and if you rock the boat, you have to do it very kindly and politely and so forth. So going on the street and demonstrating has never been Japan's way to bring about anything. So that's not how it's done in Japan. But how could it be done, right? So it has to be done much more quietly, I gather, or I mean, conversation with mentors that are enlightened. So what is the agency that Japanese women have in the Japanese setting, given the setting? Is there, you know, why do they not start support groups? Why do they not start the conversation, right? Is there a good reason for that?
I think we think that it's about showing, not telling. And like you have to earn trust before you ask for anything, or you talk. Well, I do think that talking is free, but you don't want to shake things from day one. You want to take a long period. You need patience and not going after the small fights. You have to like pick your fights and only go for the what really matters. I think that's a smart move. When you want to change things, you want to show that you can get things done. Not telling that you can get things done. You have to really show it. And in a way, I think that it might not be fair because men might get like demanding assignments from day one where women have to show that you can do that, the same thing, to actually earn that opportunity. But I guess that's how it works right now. And yeah, maybe we're like self handicapping not having that conversation. So I did see that in the US. Women started the conversation in many occasions. They like raised their voices, and that led like other people in the conversation. So I do think it's important. But yeah, it's difficult.
So there's this whole thing. You don't want it to look strange, right? So I write about it actually in my book. This whole idea that you have to fit in Japan to get ahead, right? And so if you were to dye your hair green tomorrow, everybody would be considerably worried about your mental state. Whereas in California, we would say that that's really cute, right? So you can't do certain things. So in the United States, we now have these executive programs for working women that, the power pose and the, thinking thing, and you have to speak out and you have to lean in and you have to help men change the place. But I think we all this everybody on this Zoom knows Japan and knows that that would not work in Japan because people would get worried whether you're okay, right? It's like, why is she behaving so strangely? This is not the way that women are supposed to behave. And I think that seems to me is the barrier that the sort of the hurdle that has to be overcome, right? And so I'm trying to figure out what that would be, right? So what can we advise people to do? I mean, Karen, how did this work in Germany? The German women were not expected to speak out, as you said, until 1977. They needed a permission to work, right? And so how did that happen in Germany? What did the German women do to get heard and get organized and get?
Well, I think there's a longer political history behind this in Germany, because of course we had socialist movements that are very strong, women entering trade unions. So it wasn't the same kind of suppressed culture. And I think our electoral institutions are more deeply democratic. And in general, even though women were relegated to the family, they were expected to play leading roles in their communities. Whereas even in Japan, Chonankai and such things are still controlled by men. So I don't think it's necessarily a change that happened in Germany. I think that there was an awakening in the 1970s as women became more educated, that this kind of setup didn't make sense. And there were radical parts of the movement, and this radical part of the movement also existed in Japan. Maybe it doesn't get as much press as it did in Germany. But that helped to push the mainstream, I think, a little bit closer to being open to the topic and to change. And, I think having different forces in society are important. And so I already mentioned the women's movement, the trade union movement, the political parties. And what also greatly helped in this century in Germany was the European Union. Because the European Union had a very clear policy to improve women's employment and put targets on the member states that they had to implement. And that has really pushed, I think, Germany over the edge. But we still have a very strong tendency for women to re-traditionalize after they have children. We are not over this in any way. It's still the case that most women, when they have children, even if they were working full time and are highly educated, suddenly decide to stay home for a few years, which, you know, in many career paths puts you out of the running for real advancement in the end. And we have better laws so that people can get their jobs back after that. But that's the way it works. Still, I would say in most of the cases, most of the social surveys are really surprised about that. I did want to say a point too. I mean, you know, I experienced this when I was teaching at Womenomics, that the government had put a lot of money into women's leadership programs. And I was in an institute there that was running one that I think was quite good. I mean, one thing they did was run a kind of further education segment for women on management tracks, where they came in on Saturdays ostensibly to take courses. But what it really, I mean, maybe that's what was the trick of this is that it was an educational activity. And so it masked how this became a support moment for the women who were involved. And, you know, Womenomics also teamed up with another university to open an engineering department in an all-women's university. Couldn't do it without a partner. And I was also observing in many of the natural science and technical fields, the academic associations, how women were becoming more vocal. So maybe the change does need to start in higher education, so that women are socialized differently in the technical and STEM fields, so that by the time they reach the workplace, they have some networks intact and have some capacities for speaking out, because nothing in the education system up to now has really enabled that. And maybe that was the impact also of the women's movement in Germany, that it impacted culturally on the education system. It broke down hierarchies and in many ways democratized the education system, as well as gender relations.
Saki, you want to chime in on this, or should I ask my next question? You want to add something to this?
No.
Okay, so let me, you know, one of the, let me stay with the support groups for a moment. When you were in the JUMP program here in San Diego, what we did is we actually take the participants who are working, you know, from the professionals from Japan who come to San Diego to kind of go into a different sort of setting and have their, you know, get into a different mindset of what women can do. And so they meet a bunch of, you know, women in San Diego, CEOs, CFOs, professional women, accomplished women. And what we do is we take the program participants to happy hours. And you might think, how can a happy hour possibly be part of an educational program? But the reason I decided to do that is that I noticed that there are no support groups or happy hours in Japan in the same way, right? There's a lot of activity where 120 women gather in a big, well, not now, but before COVID, gathered, but then they exchanged name cards and went back home. But what I'm talking about is a support group where women sit together and talk about what bad happened to them over the day, and then they stick their heads together and come up with a solution to that problem, or what can we do next time this happens, right? And so Saki, do you have support groups, and are there? And what I've learned is that when there's a happy hour in Japan, women talk about all kinds of things, but not work, and as if there was a culture that talking about work would be inappropriate or something. Is that right?
Yes, I would say that's generally right. I'm fortunate to have a support group. I was invited by a Japanese woman who was also a graduate of an MBA program abroad. We gather once a month and talk about women leadership, our struggles, and we also like read about. We're focusing on U.S. female leaders and trying to learn how they're about their careers and so on. So I do have a group, but it's something new for me recently. So I
So it's
would,
not common.
yes, I
It's
would say.
not, yeah. So we're getting some questions on the actual realities at the Gemba, right? So what's happening? So Pamela wants to know whether either of you know whether there's diversity is included in corporate training programs. And Amy and a few others want to know what the actual situation is. I mean, how many women are there? Is it really, I mean, it's not zero, right? Obviously, it's not zero. So how often does it happen? When we see pictures of politicians, there's maybe one woman, or maybe, my favorite picture is like 20 men sitting around a table discussing how to increase diversity in the workforce. And so the picture suggests that it's really dire. What is the reality? How many women are actually in STEM? How many women are, what do companies do? So can you talk a little bit, Saki, about your friends and the members of your support group? Are they all alone in a sea of non-diversity, or is it actually changing? And how has it changed over the last couple of years?
I do think it's changing, starting from the number of women in STEM, or I can't talk about STEM, but in civil engineering. It used to be 2 women out of like 80 men for a long period. But in my class, we had 6 women out of like 70 or something. So it is increasing. I think the numbers are much higher right now. And in the corporate world, I think it really depends on which company you're working for, in the industry, in which division. As I mentioned, civil engineering, it's an area where there's just few women. So, and I was working at a construction site, so that's also a little bit, yeah, special. So for me, it was like 1 out of 100 people. That was not too special, but that I think I was not, like, I'm not the normal. I don't know. But what surprised me was when I was not in the construction sites and when I was working in the headquarters in Tokyo, it wasn't. There were a lot of situations where I was also the only female when we were having like like management meetings with more than 80 people. Um, so that is a reality in some companies, in some divisions. But I think it is changing in other companies. I'm sure it's changing. Yeah, I'm just not in one of those
Well,
situations.
yeah. So I mean, if we look at the numbers, so Shiseido board has 80% female directors, or yeah, but it's Shiseido. Maybe that's easier. I don't know, but they've had a long history of women on the board, and so some companies are different. But I would like to also point out that if you were to go to Duisburg, where Karen teaches, and you go to a steel company, there are no women. And I mean, this is not Japan. This is an industry specific thing. I think actually when we make these comparisons, we should also do industry comparisons. If you were to go to RWE, or you would find just as few women as at TEPCO. If you go to Siemens, you find just as many, or just, well, Siemens might, I don't know, but there are women at Hitachi in very important positions, right? So I think if we did this comparison by industry, you would find that the countries are more similar than they are dissimilar, right? Karen, I saw you looking at some numbers. Do you want to add to this question of what the actual reality is?
Yeah, I couldn't find an actual number for women studying STEM. I know it's quite low, but I did find some figures for women in managerial positions. And the last figures kind of for the top level, which is equivalent to Bucho, is 6.6% are women. Kacho is 11.2 and Kakaricho is 18.3. So this is quite low. I mean, in Germany, we're nearing a quarter of managerial positions overall being held by women. And since Germany has a quota for the top listed companies of 40%, we're now around 30% of company boards being women, whereas in Japan, I think the goal is 1 woman on the board. And there are still many companies that don't have any women on the board. So
yeah, although the numbers I looked at are a little different in the sense that so Japan has a lot of listed companies compared to Germany, where even very large companies are often not listed, right? So many of the listed companies in Japan are very small and very specialized. If we look only at the JPX 400, which would actually be a reasonable equivalent to leading companies in the S&P 500 or the German whatever, then the discrepancies are much less, right? So at the very top, Japanese companies are being shamed into having at least 2 outsiders, and they have on average 8 people on board. So a woman or 2, that's actually a fairly high percentage. And so it's not 0, and so we should look at what we're comparing to, and so the numbers are still low. And then comes the reality. So we have a few questions on the reality. Yuriko wants to go back to this question about the society, and then she saw a media report in the Asahi where Prime Minister Suga goes to a shrine. I don't know whether it was Yasukuni or some other shrine, but that's not the point here. The point she's asking is the First Lady was walking 1 step behind the Prime Minister, and the Asahi commented how appropriate that was.
Inappropriate.
Appropriate.
Appropriate.
How appropriate that was. And that's Yuriko's question. I mean, is this something where society is being fed what it wants to hear? Or can media help in this? Or how can that happen, right? Because we have this whole Me Too movement among Japanese female journalists. And so as long as the media sort of say this sort of thing, probably will not see any changes. They should have said inappropriate, Karen. Is that what you're thinking?
Well, it's a big topic how the Japanese media simply prints what the government likes to hear and won't criticize. But if we take a broader view, I was watching the papers very carefully when they were discussing the secession to Abe. And, people like Inada Tomomi and Noda Seiko were quite angry and quite vocal about how, they don't have a chance. They just don't have a chance. In one article, Noda said, it's not a matter of hitting the glass ceiling, it's a matter of being pulled down by the legs. And Inada said, we have democracy without women. Those are pretty sharp statements. And, I'm reading the Asahi and the Mainichi wherever I can find an article about something like this. And I think politics is an area where Miriam Mari has said this recently too, where it has now entered the public discourse. We have a problem. And of course, the World Economic Forum plays a role there, because basically the extremely poor performance of Japan in empowering women politically more or less explains why Japan is so low on those ratings. It's actually pretty good on education and health outcomes, and in the economy it's getting better, but because it's getting worse in politics, it's pulling the whole number down. And the thing that's amazing to me, and this comes back to Abe, that should have been the area that he could influence the most, and he didn't do too well.
Yeah, that's one of the miracles in Japan, right? So when we want to do a policy change, whether that's in the United States or Germany, but certainly in the United States, if there's an announced policy change, usually the government starts first, right? More diversity in hiring. And then so the government would then do that at the, I don't know, from the post office to the schools to the government, right? And in Japan, it was announced, the quotas were announced that it would be 30% in private company, but only 15% in private companies and 7% in the government, because the government is so important. It can't be having these women or something like that. Or I don't know what the logic is. It's too hard to work in the government, or somehow impossible. So that's actually one of the miracles for me in Japan, of why the government would just not take the first step, right? So Saki, I have a question for you on the reality. There's a lot of talk, especially in the gaijin community in Tokyo, we like to complain about the Oji-san phenomenon. And the Oji-san is this uncle manager who is, quite likable, actually, and he doesn't mean harm. It's just from a different generation, from a different time, has a clearly pronounced set of biases and gets away unsanctioned with public displays of chauvinism. And people just say, "Oh, that's just an old guy," or just an old man. They don't necessarily even old. And so that is played up as a particular Japanese obstacle to getting ahead. And then once you answer, I want to ask Karen whether there aren't German equivalents to this, to this as well. Certainly, America right now is regressing, right? And we have a lot of public statements that make one shudder. So Saki, you first. So are the Oji-san should be a dying breed, right? If they're old, then they should eventually phase out, or is there a new supply of this sort of thinking? And I'm not talking about necessarily your company. Let's talk about maybe in general, other places that you know of. I understand your sister works in the government or has worked in the government. I mean, what did you hear there? Is this really a phenomenon, or are the Gaijin playing this up?
Yeah, I do think it's a phenomenon, but I do think it's changing, and they're not sanctioned because they're really harmless. They mean no, like I think they're saying things, they're acting out of, in their sense, good, and they want, they really mean no harm. I think that's one reason they get away. And it's hard to accuse people when they mean no harm, I guess, in the Japanese culture. I think it's changing. I don't think the young men will become Oji-san. I hope not.
But if there is a sufficient critical mass of them and they're allowed to continue to say things like, "Oh, the lady should bring the tea" or something, then they're just reinforcing the image, right? Shouldn't somebody say, "No, here ladies don't do tea in our company"? So shouldn't they be sort of coached, not reprimanded necessarily or sanctioned, but maybe would coaching them help, or are they not coachable? I mean, and I'm talking about this coworker, right? That we all have in all countries. They exist everywhere, and so my question is not so much is this a specific Japanese breed? I actually don't think it is a Japanese breed, but how we react to them differs by cultural setting, right? And what we can do to coach them and help them see the light and change their behavior, because they don't mean any harm. They might actually be completely dense on the topic, right?
Yes, yes. In that sense, I think they are coachable. Like no one would say the women should bring tea right now. I think people will definitely raise their voices if someone says such things. So they are coachable. The women just need courage to speak up, maybe.
Karen, what's the? I mean, it's been a long time since I worked in Germany. I certainly remember in the old days there were lots of such people, and the woman belongs behind the hearth, and and even a president once said that, not so far in the distant. So what are the German tactics, if I may use that word, to coach such to make those displays go away?
It really is context dependent. So in the context that I'm in a university where there's lots of women and now an awareness that there are lines you cannot cross, that kind of behavior is directed towards secretaries, but not towards other professors. It may still be directed towards students, but that's very dangerous now because of the Me Too movement. So men are on guard. I don't think they've really changed, but they're on guard. But it has a class dynamic. So the secretaries still get a lot of this. But if we're in these kind of workplaces that I was talking about with very masculinized cultures, even professional women, it will happen in very subtle ways. And in ways, like Saki said, where it's depicted as harmless, but it's not so harmless. For instance, a woman will always get remarks on what she's wearing, whereas nobody would say that to a man. And there are very subtle things, which of course puts women on guard, because then they're very careful about what they wear in certain situations. But I think it really depends on context, and we have very masculinized cultures in specific industrial sectors where professional women get remarks that they have to deal with, whether it isn't time for them to go home or something like that. I mean, it comes out in other subtle ways. It's okay for men in those situations to talk about their personal family situations, their kid's birthday. But if a woman does it, then she's not serious about her work. She's just thinking about her family, and she has clouds in her head. So there are really different behavioral patterns that are enforced for men and women in those contexts. But we certainly have it.
So we have a lot of very good questions about, how business can react. Maybe we'll have to do a follow-up on this and see what businesses can do in the labor shortage. But Catherine has a question on education and young girls, and I think that would be a good question to kind of make a final round on. And that is, we all know that where, it starts in kindergarten, if not before, this tight culture, socialization, and what is the polite behavior, what is the appropriate behavior. And there are, I understand, and Saki, I will have to lean on you here and your experience from kindergarten, but there are differences, right? Even gender differences, even that everybody wears the same yellow cap and the same uniform, even in kindergarten. It's cute and it's wonderful, and that's all the same, so that's good. But then my understanding is that when the report card comes in, that for girls, the right attitude is obedience. And for boys, that's not necessarily the same in the same way. Is that right? Are there subtle differences? And then Catherine's question is, okay, so what would have to happen, even as early as kindergarten, if we want to have more women in STEM, if we want to have more women in politics? What would be some of your ideas on how Japan can make some important changes? Saki, you want to go first on that?
Education at a younger age.
Well, education in general, but probably, if you ask us as professors, I speak for you, Karen, by the time they come to the university, it's too late, right? So an interest in STEM has to start a little earlier than at age 20 something, right? So yes, we're talking about earlier education.
I actually went to a all girls junior high and high school, which I loved it. There's no like differentiation between men and women, because we're all girls. We have to do everything. People, I have no idea if it results in difference in the percentage of people who go into STEM education or not. I have no idea, but it was definitely good in a sense of not being like placed in a box named women. There was no expectation of like acting as a woman, I guess. So that was useful. I'm not sure if it's good or not.
So hey, yeah, let's go back and co-ed so that we can women can be whatever they want. Karen, that it's an academic question a little bit. You work on this sort of thing, so give us sort of the final comment to our fabulous session here. What do you think Japan can do in terms of changing the education system, if at all? Is there anything in kindergarten that could be done that would really change things?
Well, there are very subtle things that have been suggested by women's organizations, such as not letting boys march into the school before girls. There are very subtle ways in which the differences are symbolically expressed, and teachers' unions in the past have thematized these things. But of course, it's different to change one school after the other. Parents are important. And I think, you know, even parents are more important in some ways, and also, you know, not just parents, but aunts and grandmothers. And I mean, one of my favorite recent books was this book by Sui Lin Ho on women's friendship circles in business. And all of these women who are really ahead of business all talk about the formative role of their mothers or grandmothers, who had often very traditional lives, but didn't want their children to have those lives. So I think that's important. And then all these kinds of public programs to support girls in sciences and math. I mean, we have these girls' days in Germany where they're brought into the labs to see that it's not a scary, mysterious place. And the universities have also set up things for the schools. We have a whole summer program where girls come to campus already in the 9th or the 10th grade and do projects together with some of the doctoral students and assistants. Those kinds of public programs are extremely important. And there is a big interest in the Japanese engineering and science community because the labor shortages are really facing them too. I mean, if Japan's going to innovate, it needs to use all the talent that it possibly can muster. So I think, you know, building across those kind of coalitions, it's a good time for it. It's a very good time.
Well, on that happy note, it's never a good time to end, but on that happy note, let me bring this to a close. Time is up. Thank you very much, both of you. Terrific conversation. We'll do this again. I'll bring the women topic back up because we haven't even talked about the agency of the CEO and the large companies and pushing this forward. So there's more to discuss. Thank you very much, Professor Shire. Thank you very much. Tomita Kacho, I guess you are now, or some manager. So thank you both, and everybody, please stay healthy and take good care. And I'll see you again next week.
Thanks so much, Ulrika.
Thank you very much. Goodbye.